It's hard to tell. We're welcome back a friend of ours, Zeke Webster. He's an attorney. He's a public defender. He is a sometimes contributor at ordinary-times.com. Hint, 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 Zeke, we miss you. Get to writing when you get a chance there, when you're not defending the downtrodden and upholding freedom and justice. How are you, sir?
I'm doing just fine. How are you?
Good. We did a little back and forth on Twitter. I wanted to get your thoughts on it because I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have. But you were doing what you normally do. You were advocating for legal matters and matters of justice. And you started talking about sentencing guidelines and sentencing standards, especially when it comes to things like life without parole. Just real quickly, so you can kind of overview, let's make sure we got our nomenclature right. Life without parole, what does that specifically mean? What does it mean legally? And is the parlance, the way we take that to mean it, the way it actually is in the books and in the court of law?
Well, it's one of those things where you always have to attach an asterisk to everything you say about this, because criminal law varies a great deal from state to state, and something can be true in one state, not true in another. But in general, when you use the term life without parole, that means that life is exactly what it says it is. That you will never, under any circumstances, get out of prison, so long as that sentence is upheld. So. You kind of can think of it as a continuum between a death sentence, where the state will kill you in prison, and life without parole, which is a guarantee that you will die in prison of some other causes than an execution. And then below that, you have life with the possibility of parole, where you may die in prison, or at some point down the line, usually after a very long period of time that's set up by statute, you may become eligible to be released on parole. And so the main distinction here is that there's the third of those categories is the only one that really leaves any kind of discretion or any possibility of the sentence changing in response to what changes in the life of the person sentenced over the course of a very long period of time in which the sentence is carried out.
So let's break this down just a little bit, though, because like you just mentioned, like we've seen in these court cases, this is highly changeable and susceptible state to state. Federal guidelines are even different because there's no parole system at all. That has a lot to do with this as well, doesn't it? So even though we're going to kind of talk about it in broad terms, there's a lot of minutia here when you get into the individual states and municipalities.
For sure. It's one of those things where I can speak with some authority about North Carolina, with less authority on any state where I've taken some time to do some research on their sentencing regime, and with very little authority at all on any other state. But you do tend to see a lot of things that don't have to be the same from one jurisdiction to another, but nonetheless are areas where a lot of different places arrive at kind of a similar destination for often similar reasons.
Yeah, Zeke Webster, attorney, joining us. All right, so let's get into kind of a common trope that we see on social media, something we hear in social media a lot, being tough on crime. I know you push back on this a lot, but I want to give you a little bit of deck to kind of articulate this a little bit further. Of just because a sentencing guideline isn't life in prison without parole or life with parole or the death penalty or the harshest penalties we got on the books, there seems to be this small-mindedness that there's no medium of talking the most of somebody's life or the majority of somebody's life. And there seems to be this argument of, well, to be on tough on crime, you have to take it completely out of anybody's hands to ever review this case ever again, ever. And that's where you start to have some problems with it, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of kind of different angles to take on it. But to begin with, I simply don't believe in eye for an eye. They talk to you in law school about the purposes of punishment and theories of punishment and so on. And, part of what a criminal punishment is supposed to do is to, in some way, kind of even the cosmic scales, that if somebody's done wrong and it caused grievous harm to other people, that they should, in some way or another be made to suffer to balance that out. And I don't think that I completely discount that as a purpose to do anything, but when you're doing that, what you're doing is you're increasing the amount of suffering in the world. And it may be that provides some sense of closure or justice to people who have suffered as a result of the crime that took place. But fundamentally, it does not and it cannot undo the harm that was caused. And what it can do is it can make life worse for the person being punished, for the family of the person being punished, and sometimes for other people that don't have anything at all to do with whatever wrong that was done. And so, like, in that context, if you're looking at sentences of 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, that's an extremely long time. That's a life-changing amount of time. And if somebody I just kind of like try to anchor it in my own experience, right? That if you look at a sentence that in the context of a serious felony, a lot of people might not think of as being all that long, 10 years, right? Well, I'm 35 right now. I'm a married practicing public defender, and when I was 25, I was a guy waiting tables outside that had just gotten out of college. I think that the bulk of my adult life has all happened over the span of 10 years. And people can grow and change a great deal in that amount of time. And a lot of things can happen that if you're in jail, you miss. If somebody has young children and they go to prison for 10 years, you're basically missing out on all of that child growing up. You're probably going to miss out on the deaths of your parents. In a lot of these cases, you're going to miss out on anything and everything for a very long time. And that's above and beyond the fact that as they currently exist, jails and prisons in this country are dangerous, brutal places where a lot of people have terrible things happen to them in prison that are not supposed to be part of their punishment. It is a national disgrace, the extent to which we turn a blind eye to sexual assault and other violence that happens inside prisons. And I think that anybody listening to this, if you were faced with the possibility of doing 10 years in prison, you would regard that as an awful, awful thing that you would do just about anything to avoid. And so I think given all that, you can't look at 10 years and say, oh, well, that's just a slap on the wrist. It's not, even for very, very serious crimes that cause very, very serious harm to other people.
What do you think the disconnect is? I mean, I know that's just people spewing on social media. That's not real life. We talk about that a lot, but there is a overriding sentiment. I'm sure you've ran into it in the course of your work, because when people hear you're a lawyer, especially the public defender, I'm sure you get those kind of questions a lot. Where's the disconnect? I know we confuse, the law doesn't really have a good answer for what's justice and what's retribution and those kind of more philosophical questions, because you got to put this stuff in black and white. But it has to fall into those realms because we're dealing with people here. Where do you think the disconnect there is, where we start thinking, okay, convict, and we stop thinking person?
Well, I think that you just hit at the heart of it, is that it is much easier to think about these things if you can create an understanding of the world for yourself, where there's two kinds of people. There's good, normal people that would never commit a serious crime. And then there's criminals, there's convicts, there's brutal monsters that just need to be separated from the rest of us. And the thing about that is that in many cases, people don't realize how much a otherwise totally normal person might wind up doing if they were put in the wrong situation on the wrong day at the wrong place and time. And when you do the work that I do, you find yourself meeting people in person that have been accused or that have been convicted of rapes and murders and homicides. And almost every time you sit down in a room to talk to somebody that has that in their past, and they don't actually come off that different from anybody else you ever sat down in the room to talk to. I'm a big believer that fundamentally we are all human. We are all complicated, and that the moral value of a person is more than the worst thing they've ever done. And when you dig into it, it's very messy and uncomfortable, but ultimately that's the truth that we deal with. And so that's why I often think that whether or not somebody is guilty is sometimes a less interesting question than what we're going to do about it, and whether what we're going to do about it is something that will actually make the world a better place.
Yeah, we're talking to Zeke Webster, our friend, attorney, and we're going to get into more of that, these sentencing guidelines. We're going to talk about things like the Arbery case, which we had a little bit of a bumping of heads on, and we'll discuss that as an example of this and a lot more right after this on Her Tell. Welcome back to Her Tell. I'm Andrew Donaldson, still joined by Zeke Webster, our attorney friend who's becoming a regular on the program. We love to have him because he is on the sharp, pointy end of our criminal justice system, doing the public defender work, God's work down there. We were talking about these cases. Let's talk about a big case that got a lot of national attention, Ahmaud Arbery. I don't want to deal with the bad faith actors because anybody with a functional frontal cortex saw this video, looked at this case, and knows exactly what happened here. Um, I was good with the verdict. I wrote about the verdict. The people who showed no remorse, and the two people I think that was most responsible for the crime, the one that pulled the trigger and the one that, in my opinion, I think the evidence bore it out, the father that masterminded this whole thing, got the life without parole. The other person that was there that showed remorse and cooperated, he got mercy as it was with the possibility of parole. But even within that, I felt that was a just sentencing. You still had a little bit of pushback because you seem to have a consistency when it comes to life without parole, however.
Yeah, I mean, I unsurprisingly, I'm also an opponent of the death penalty, and I often have an attitude when you look at somebody like, say, like Dylan Roop, right? People that commit extremely heinous crimes, mass murders, people that target innocent people for absolutely no good reason at all, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My attitude is generally that if we're going to have the death penalty, I guess this is the right sort of person to apply it to, but I don't think that we should have the death penalty. And that's how I feel about life without parole for this case. I mean, I'm not going to spend any of my time whatsoever defending the McMichaels or minimizing what they did, because I don't think there's any honest way to do that. And I don't think that it is particularly likely that over the course of however much time these men have left on earth, that they are likely to change in a way that would make me feel good about them being released from prison. But the thing is that we don't right now know the future. And so, Travis McMichael's 35, and it may well be that he's going to go to his deathbed having not shown any genuine remorse, having not shown any meaningful change, or at least not enough to really change how we should feel about him as a person. But there are a lot of stories out there of people in their often as teenagers or in their early 20s who wind up going to prison for their entire lives because of something that they did when they were very young, and something very, very awful that they did when they were very young, who really do manage to accomplish what we would think of as rehabilitation in prison, who do everything that you could imagine a person doing to atone, to accept responsibility, to change who they are, and to have a positive impact on the world. And when you've got somebody that maybe 30 or 40 years down the road really has achieved that kind of reformation, I think that there should still be at least a chance at eventual freedom for somebody like that. And so, I think that if we were to leave open the possibility of parole for the McMichaels, I don't think that they would ever actually deserve it, and I don't think they would ever actually get it. But I don't know that for sure. And I don't like that there's no possibility left open for any kind of change far down the road in the future. And I also don't like that this is all taking place in a set of statutes that remove the possibility for leaving this kind of thing open. Because there are a lot of other cases where people have done, in my view, still very, very serious, grievous crimes, but crimes that I think are less inexcusable than what the McMichaels did, who still face mandatory life without parole. And when you set the system up so that there's no off ramp, there's no way to account for the complications of life or any kind of way in which people might grow or change or try to atone, you wind up with injustice. And that's the real thing that I object to.
Yeah, and I'll just be honest here. This isn't a philosophical argument. This is just my feelings on it. I feel a lot of like when you're talking about this, like I do on the death penalty, I can get like 99% of the way there. I can almost get there, and then you get, the literal baby killers of the world. You get a war criminal. You get a McMichaels who just straight up lynch a guy in broad daylight and expect to get it. You get those outlier cases. Is this where we need to go back to what you were talking about before of trusting I know we hate to say trusting the system because that sounds, Pollyannish, but this is why you have a parole review board. This is why you have people designated outside of the criminal justice system to come in later and review these things 10, 15, 20 years later. Is it just a matter of trust, or is it a matter of not understanding how a parole review works down the road, that, hey, they're not just letting criminals out, although you can probably find examples of that. That's their job, to review these things after the fact, after there's been sometimes decades of new information and personal change in these people.
Yeah, and I guess my attitude would be that anytime you set up an institution like a parole board, it's going to make errors in both directions. It's going to both release people that maybe should not have been released, and it's going to keep people in prison that really should have been released. And my attitude, and this may just be my kind of public defender spirit on it, is that I always feel more moved by somebody who remains in a cage that really, really shouldn't be, than by the prospect of letting a moral monster out after several decades. And the thing is that when you can't make a system just for the really, really exceptional cases. You can't design these absolute punishments of life without parole or the death penalty and ensure that they're only ever going to apply to the absolute worst of the worst. And in practice, what we've seen for many, many, many years of this process is that, the people that get sentenced to death are overwhelmingly poor people of color, people that did not have effective legal representation at the trial level. And, those aren't the things that should be determining these results, but in practice they are. And, when you set things up and you say that, well, for this charge, it's mandatory life without parole, sure, you're going to get some people that get mandatory life without parole who really are never, ever, ever going to be safe to release from prison. But you're also going to get a bunch of people that are going to have their entire lives taken away where there really wasn't what needed to happen in their case.
Yeah, Zeke Webster joining us. One last quick question for you, kind of put a bow on this. We're talking some big picture stuff. This is, total criminal justice sentencing hearing. This is a lot of stuff that's outside of the normal person's reach to really do much about other than talk about it. Where do you think we start with trying to make something like this better? Is it on the institutional side, doing prison reform, parole reform, things like that? Or is this another example where we'd probably be better going after the prosecutor side of it, where they're more, most of those are elected officials. You can put down sentencing guidelines. You can put pressure on that way. We've seen some high profile cases like out in Colorado where they had to come back and revise things after public pressure. What should the average citizen be focusing on there? Is it the institutional side or is it the official side, do you think?
I mean, I think it always has to be a mix of both. People should vote. They should make informed votes in district attorney elections, elections for sheriff, things like that. And in particular to this kind of stuff, people should not try to get out of jury duty. I mean, if it's a hardship that is not, I understand for some people it really, really, really is an unacceptable hardship to serve on a jury, but I think that the jury is a really powerful institution of self-government if we allow it to be. And for it to work the way it ought to work, that requires people to really take it seriously and to serve thoughtfully. And that's I think if I were if I have to ask one thing of people that are listening, that'd probably be the most concrete one. Just try and get on a jury the next time you get called and think about this kind of stuff.
As with everything else, the complexities of the legal system, if we kind of do the little things, we might actually do some good with it, right?
Yeah.
Zeke Webster, we appreciate you. He's a regular on the program. You can find him on Twitter at Don Zico, and he is going to be doing all kinds of great stuff for us in the future at Ordinary Times and on Twitter, advocating. He does that. And although we disagree some, sir, I appreciate your consistency in your viewpoint. And I hope you're doing well. Appreciate your time today.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right. Talk again soon, sir. Appreciate your time.